Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, back in the studio for another program. Daniel, good to see you.
It's good to be back, Dr. Paul. How are you?
Well, very good.
Good.
You know, we didn't have our video yesterday, but I'm fascinated that some people will even listen to us, and maybe they don't worry about watching us at all. But anyway, I think that the discussion comes out more spontaneously, and I'm glad we can do the studio. But I'm also glad that people are fascinated with the ideas and what's going on in the news. And today, Daniel, I'd like to talk about, military suicides, veteran suicides. And this issue was talked a lot a couple years back, as the war was proceeding. The war is still going on, but it's not quite as deadly. And the number that was thrown out that got everybody's attention, that veterans were committing suicide at 22 per day. Yeah. And there's a little bit of challenge on the statistic because they don't keep it running, but it is still very significant. And the article we looked at today said it's still a big problem. And the Pentagon has been concerned about it because the people are concerned. I'm sure they're sincere, and they've come up with a new approach, supposedly, new program to try to solve this problem of suicide. But, when I read this, and I think you might have had the same reaction, it sounded like they wanted a bureaucratic answer. They didn't really go into the medical part very much. They didn't go into foreign policy at all. But they just thought, better coordination. We need to keep records here, and we need to know what the other ones are doing. And we need to send more money. So they had an appropriation of $24 million to study this and keep records and try to head off these suicides. But it struck me as not really dealing with the issue, and hopefully we can contribute a little bit to that, because it is so obviously a serious problem. And if you want to be blunt about it, there wouldn't be many veteran suicides if we didn't have so many wars. Yeah. And that's a little simplistic, but I think there's a little bit of truth to that.
Yeah, and this, thanks to antiwar.com, we saw this piece from Defense One, where they had this Defense Suicide Prevention Office. The thing has been up and running since I think 2011, but it's been plagued, according to the article, by leadership turnover, funding uncertainty. It's always that, of course. Employee complaints, canceled contracts, low morale, mismanagement. So the place is a mess. To tackle this phenomenal problem, this huge problem, in 2018, 325 active duty suicides, the highest number since they started collecting data in 2001. You wonder why they just started it then. What's the significance of that? But as you point out, the big solution that they're having, I was expecting something that sounded really good. It was pretty disappointing. Publish an annual suicide report. Okay, that's great. Evaluate their programs. Okay, that's a good one. And more collaboration with NGOs, academia, and other government agencies to look at the best way. This seems like a no-brainer that you would have started with in 2011. My thought when I was reading these, Dr. Paul, is they're kind of ignoring the elephant in the room.
Right. The suicides are noticeable. They can count the suicides. But what they can't count, which contributes to depression and this problem, is that there's a lot of things they can't record or they don't record, and that is what these wars have done to their families. It's very destructive to family life, very destructive to marriages, and we also have to look at all the injuries and the problems that people have after they come back. But the number that really struck me is we lost a lot of military personnel in active duty, but they've learned to be a little more cautious, use remote bombs and drones and all this. So the numbers weren't anything like we suffered in Vietnam, but still way too many. But between 2008 and 16, that's just an 8-year period, 6,000 veterans committed suicide. That has to be over, adding up all the military personnel that was lost in the war.
Yeah, more than that. Yeah, more than the people killed in combat. It's the suicide.
Right.
It's amazing. And I was looking at a recent VA study. It said that deployed veterans have a 41% higher suicide rate compared to the general U.S. population. That's incredible.
And I think that there are some medical things that they should be looking into. They approach this medically, but I've heard the stories. It's been in the media, and we do know it. And from experience, I know what some of the doctors do. I know how rushed. In medical school, we all had to go through the VA hospital. We know what it's like. There's not a whole lot of personal care. So, and they're busy. And anyway, the motivations are different, and there's a lot of pills passed out. So the psychiatrists, of course, know what's right. We give them pills. We give them antidepressants. And I think they're deadly. They probably are helpful. I would not say that nobody ever qualifies for an antidepressant. But the antidepressants are well known to contribute, and these individuals, especially the high school and college kids that go on a rampage, they've been on antidepressant drugs. And so I am positive that one time or another, these people have been on drugs and could have been on drugs at the very time they committed suicide. But there's other drugs too. There are illegal drugs that they get exposed to, and people say, try this.
Yeah.
And this combination doesn't solve the problem if it's a much deeper problem, and I think that's what they fail to get to. And there are some people who do talk about the lingering guilt, and I really subscribe to that being a major problem. But it was so disappointing when I read, and this is not true of all who say they're Christians and they want to give them Christian treatment, but I was so discouraged to see one Christian group say, well, you're guilty, you're feeling guilty, but you don't need to, because God told us in the Old Testament that war was justifiable, and if a government tells you they're justifiable, you shouldn't have any guilt about this. But try and talk somebody who witnessed this, the atrocious killing of little kids and all this going on, who never attacked us. That must sink in, and they're almost afraid to even think it or say it. And they bury that in their soul, and I think that adds to depression. So there's probably many causes, whether it's the drugs and the medication, what they've had to be exposed to, but I've often wondered too about the environment. I'm literally saying direct environment, because we've reported and talked about how deadly some of these burn pits are, and we still do that. We burn all these medical supplies and things, and it's supposed to be, this can have an effect. It can have an effect. I mean, just think of some of the poisons that we breathe in, and the sprays that we get involved with. I would think that could be. So there's a lot of, but they never talked anything about this. We'll collect the statistics, more statistics, more bureaucrats, and of course, I'd still like to see a lot less war, and we'd have a lot less veteran suicide, I'll tell you that.
Well, on the drug issue, I think it's really important because these drugs are cheaper than therapy. These long-term therapies, they talk it out. They connect with other veterans. It may be more effective, and some of the things that I've read said that there needs to be more, that there isn't. It's a lot cheaper to throw a pill at these people. Say, hey, what's your problem? Take this. In fact, on August 21st, so just less than a month ago, according to a Military Times article, President Trump announced that he instructed the VA to make a massive purchase of the antidepressant Spravato. It's a controversial new kind of drug, but he was bragging. He was at a rally talking about the problem of military suicide, and he said, and I told the VA to get a much of this, and we got a good deal on it, by the way. We got a ton of this, and it's a political approach. We're going to solve this problem. Here's a couple of pills. Whereas the real problem, as we're trying to say here, is something much deeper that requires a lot more, that requires some questions that they don't like to have asked.
To me, this is so much different than, let's say you're in a bank during a robbery and there's a lot of violence and you witness it and you see people killed, and this would stick with you and would have a bad image. But I think this is so much different, because these individuals that go over there are people who are patriotic. They join the National Guard and the reserves, and they're supposed to be defending their states and defending this country. You get over there for 6 or 8 trips to these areas, and they can get pretty depressed over that. Then it dawns on them, it's not like witnessing, a bank robbery, which they had nothing to do with, but they're witnessing something that, why is my government doing this? Why did they send me here? Why are we killing so many? Yes, less American soldiers died over there, but they know a lot of civilians died over there too, and they know they participated in it. And I think the one big problem is that they don't verbalize that. And you say there's good therapy. Maybe they would, but I still think they concentrate on the drugs, because this whole idea of witnessing this and not knowing why are we there and what are we doing, I'm following orders, but I think that gnaws away at them. I don't know what it is. Maybe if they get all these statistics studied, maybe there would be a time element here. Do they go 3 years of suffering with these thoughts, or do they go 6 months? It seems like it can go on for years, and then they finally just have had enough. They've tried everything in the world to help them, but it to me is really a sad situation. And this whole idea, they're just weak people, and this is the way it is. And I guess the psychopaths who end up in the military, they have no problems with this.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned off camera that the difference between now and something like World War II, where you knew the starting time, you knew who the enemy was, you knew how to defeat, what it means to win the war, for the war to be over. Well, in today's forever wars, they have no idea who they're fighting, or why they're fighting, or where they're fighting, or what victory looks like. So that must be disheartening. It's like Sisyphus pushing the stone up the hill and it rolls down. There's no sense of completion.
Yeah, I think that's a major problem. But what is that a reflection of? It's a reflection of our foreign policy.
Yeah.
And if they don't invite a discussion of the relationship of the whole theme of our foreign policy and what we're dealing with here, I don't think they can solve the problem. And that would greatly reduce the amount of killing and wars going on, but it would be without looking at the overall foreign policy. I think this will continue because we've been trying to encourage the president to stick to his guns on Afghanistan, and it looks like
maybe
after 19 years the troops are coming. Except the big argument is, the CIA still has a responsibility there to maintain order, and I think we have a responsibility to get rid of the CIA. That might help us stay out of a lot of these wars.
The funny thing, you see Trump wants more pills, the VA wants to do more collecting. The one thing it doesn't seem like they really do enough of is just talk to the vets. Why are they feeling this way? I came across a powerful editorial op-ed published by a gentleman called Danny O'Neill, back in January of this year. He was in the military, and he talks about what happened. This is pretty powerful, so I'll read a couple of sentences. I'm supposed to be a statistic, he wrote in USA Today earlier this year. On July 14th, 2012, drowning in grief and guilt, he talked about that, I tried to kill myself. Like so many veterans, I found civilian life desperately difficult. War had drained me of joy. The sights, sounds, and smells of the battlefield had been relentlessly looping in my head. The suffering seemed endless. And so, thinking there were no other options of escape, I tried suicide. And he was, fortunately, he was unsuccessful. But he goes on to say, I enlisted in the military on September 11, 2001. The first major combat experience came in a deployment of Sadr City, Iraq in the winter of 2005, the apex of the insurgency. One little bit more. This is a good point. War inflicts permanent psychic scars on survivors. Scrubbing a friend's flesh out of a Bradley reconnaissance vehicle, packing up the cold clothes of a new dad to ship home to his family, etc., etc. The trauma from these experiences is deep and lasting. And this is the final sentence. That trauma can be more deadly than war itself, which comes back to your statistic of the 6,000 more people killed themselves than were killed in the wars.
That's right.
Very powerful.
There's a story I tell in my book, Swords into Plowshares, and it had to do with a suicide example. And and I can remember especially the final word on this. The man committed suicide, and then there was a funeral, and then there were a lot of eulogies, and they were all missing the target. It was all gibberish stuff, and you know, he needed this, he needed that, he was exposed to this, making excuses and all. And so the person that was closest to him, I believe it was his brother, got up for his eulogy because they figured he was the closest person to him.
Yeah.
He got up, and I think it was just 3 or 4 words. It was the war.
Yeah.
You know, they were given all these other reasons. It was just its exposure to that war, and it was no more complicated than that. And that's why, you know, it is important for us to talk about the foreign policy, because you're not allowed to, because you're being unpatriotic if you're not supporting the troops. Would you do this? You know, if we are in a death struggle with somebody, well, you know, this whole thing is. But this idea of these kind of wars being based on patriotism and purity for patriotism is a real challenge. So I'm sure maybe even when some of these military personnel were a long time before they got out, they might have had second givings, but they were still there shooting at people.
Yeah.
You know, and sometimes they had orders to shoot totally innocent people. And of course, that occurred a lot in Vietnam too. Innocent people were killed. But that is the case all the time. You know, that civilians get killed, non-participants, and we don't even want to talk about it. It's not people, it's collateral damage. They're not even people that die, it's collateral damage. You know, 100 people died. Just yesterday, I think there was somebody bombed the prison, 100 people died. It's just collateral damage. We didn't mean to do that.
Yeah. So it's okay.
And that inconsistency, I think, is very dangerous, and also this thing that there's no end in sight, and you've already mentioned that.
Well, the difficult question to sum up really is, what if there is no way to treat the problem? You talk about pills, therapy, this and that. What if there really is no way to treat the problem and you have to deal with the actual cause, which is our foreign policy? I would just close by saying it's good to be back. We had a great trip up to Washington. But I will say they want to silence us. They want to silence shows like this. You know, the social media, the mainstream media, they're hand in glove with government-funded agencies that want to get rid of all this content that goes against the narrative that we've got to keep going, be the world's empire, the world's policeman. So to fight back, we need you to keep watching us, and we appreciate you watching us. We're getting close to 200,000 subscribers on a show, Dr. Paul, as you know, that's not a good news show. So it's tough to watch sometimes. But if you're not subscribed, if you could just click subscribe, get your friends to subscribe. I think we only have about 8,000 or something to get up there to 200,000. That would be a great milestone, and then to build from there. So this is one way we can fight back with our eyes, with our votes. We vote with our eyes and with our time, the time you spend with us. And we're grateful for the time you do spend with us, and we hope to see you again soon. Dr. Paul?
Thank you, Daniel. And I want to just close by sort of summarizing what we've been talking about. This is a very important issue. Generally, it's not dealt with, or we wouldn't have so much of a problem with suicide of our military personnel and our veterans. But you know, it's the two things that we have to consider. One, is this a medical problem? I go to the doctor, give you some pills, or is it something else? And it's either a medical problem or a political problem that we shouldn't be engaged. But both of those things do contribute. I believe it's a political problem more so than just a medical problem. And therefore, treating him with pills is probably doing it in denial, refusing to admit it. And Daniel Strong's suggestion was, why don't more people actually talk to him? And I've mentioned that, you know, the doctors that I knew, and this is not the final word about veteran hospitals, because I'm sure there's some that do a very good job, but they never had time to do this. It's much easier to just to give pills. Matter of fact, even outside veteran hospitals, we've drifted to that condition because we do know that some of the violence in our schools and things, the mass shooting, have occurred with these antidepressants. So these drugs are horrible. In the 60s, the medications were used, but not as extensively as they are used now, but they also had a lot of illegal drugs, and I'm sure that is the problem. So yes, it's medical, but the medical, I believe, is secondary to the political situation, and you're not going to solve this problem with more pills and better statistics and trying to spend more money on coordinating agencies of government. I don't believe that'll happen. I think we have to have a definite change in the way we look at the world and what our responsibilities are in the world, and whether there's any justification to go into perpetual bankrupting, unconstitutional, immoral wars like we've been involved in for so long, and now we're still deciding, well, should we leave Afghanistan? And the president, it looks like he's trying hard to, but you know what? It doesn't even look like, in spite of all our problems, that we'll march out of Afghanistan, because even those who say we're marching out, oh yes, but we got to keep some people back there behind just in case they need us. So I think this is a very important subject, and it does a lot of teaching about even about medicine as well as the pros and cons of our foreign policy. But I do want to thank all of you for tuning in today and joining us in this Liberty Report. Please come back soon.